Before we start, I must apologize in advance for my pronunciation of French words. I don't believe French was ever intended to be spoken with a Texas accent. Imagine that Americans are loved in France today by people of all ages. It's true, and I've got the pictures and stories to prove it. Welcome to Normandy Loves Us, the Untold Story. Pictured here are schoolchildren in Normandy celebrating the 67th anniversary of D-Day in June 2011. An ancient church stands in the middle of the small town of Saint-Mary-Église. The church looks similar to the other churches that mark the countryside of Normandy, except for one thing. A life-size mannequin dressed as a World War II American paratrooper hangs from a real parachute high above the ground on the church's spire. It commemorates the plight of an American paratrooper who survived after being caught on the spire amid enemy fire during the early morning hours of D-Day. He was one of the many American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division who dropped in and around Saint-Mary-Église and captured this strategically located town to protect the western flank of the Utah Beach invasion. However, for those paratroopers who landed in the town square, it couldn't have been any worse. Buildings in Saint-Mary-Église were on fire as the American paratroopers, who overshot their drop zone, began to descend. The German soldiers took full advantage of this shooting gallery as the Americans, illuminated in the night sky by the fires, were slaughtered. But the paratrooper mannequin hanging from the church's spire is not the only tribute at the church to American bravery on D-Day. Inside this stately stone structure, dating from the 11th century, a large stained glass window majestically commands attention, bursting with sunlight and featuring the Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus, surrounded by figures of American paratroopers, descending from heaven, larger than life, in great detail and in full battle gear, their sidearm holsters and jump knives plainly visible. The unexpected juxtaposition of the Virgin and Child, surrounded by armed American paratroopers, can feel slightly jarring, yet compelling to the onlooker. Inside the church, across from the stained glass window, stands a wall, pockmarked with bullet holes from the fighting to liberate the town. A stark reminder of the death and sacrifice of the American paratroopers and the townspeople on D-Day. This recent photo taken outside Saint-Mary-Église shows the townspeople congratulating the American paratroopers who reenacted the D-Day jump. Saint-Mary-Église was the first town in France liberated in World War II, and as this picture demonstrates, will always be grateful to the Americans. And Americans can always be grateful to Saint-Mary-Église for inspiring us to better appreciate what it means to be an American. D-Day was Tuesday, June 6, 1944. D-Day was the largest amphibious invasion in history. 175,000 soldiers, 12,000 airplanes, and 5,000 ships crossed the English Channel. Normandy is across from England and the English Channel. Paris is a 3-hour drive to the D-Day beaches. Brittany is the province next to Normandy. There were 5 D-Day invasion beaches, from left to right, the 2 American beaches, Utah and Omaha, and the 3 British or Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Between the 2 American beaches was a small but critical strip of land called Pointe du Hoc. If you added together all the bombs the Allies dropped on Pointe du Hoc, They were equivalent to the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. These bomb craters are huge. This is a typical Pointe-du-Hoc bomb crater. Some are over 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. But why was this tiny strip of land so important? Let's hear President Reagan's words from one of his most famous speeches entitled "The Boys of Pointe-du-Hoc," given in 1984 on location on the 40th anniversary of D-Day.
We're here to mark that day in history when the Allied armies joined in battle to reclaim this continent to liberty. For 4 long years, much of Europe had been under a terrible shadow. Free nations had fallen. Jews cried out in the camps. Millions cried out for liberation. Europe was enslaved and the world prayed for its rescue. Here in Normandy, the rescue began. Here the Allies stood and fought against tyranny in a giant undertaking unparalleled in human history. We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. The air is soft, but 40 years ago at this moment, the air was dense with smoke and the cries of men, and the air was filled with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of cannon. At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, 225 Rangers jumped off the British landing craft and ran to the bottom of these cliffs. Their mission was one of the most difficult and daring of the invasion: to climb these sheer and desolate cliffs and take out the enemy guns. The Allies had been told that some of the mightiest of these guns were here, and they would be trained on the beaches to stop the Allied advance. The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades, and the American Rangers began to climb. They shot rope ladders over the face of these cliffs and began to pull themselves up. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe. 225 came here. After 2 days of fighting, only 90 could still bear arms. And behind me is a memorial that symbolizes the Ranger daggers that were thrust into the top of these cliffs. And before me are the men who put them there. These are the boys of Pointe-du-Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. And these are the heroes who helped end a war.
Emily Castell, a young Frenchwoman, told me, "I am a granddaughter of liberty. My grandparents were in Normandy during World War II and lost everything. But in 1944, they were liberated, free, and alive." Emily works at the Brittany American Cemetery. Only U.S. soldiers are buried there, most of whom lost their lives in the Normandy and Brittany campaigns following D-Day. There are 4,410 American graves. She grew up 2 miles from the cemetery and always wanted to work there since she was a child. She told me that so many people in the region talked about World War II while she was growing up, that she decided to specifically study the heritage of Normandy, and a large part of the heritage was the Battle of Normandy. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Emily was one of over 4,400 French school children to take part in a ceremony at the cemetery in which one French child stood on each grave, and all sang together to honor the American soldiers buried there. Also, there was a small white box on each grave in front of each child. the children opened all the boxes simultaneously and released over 4,400 doves who flew away together. Emily described the total experience as emotional and unforgettable. According to Emily, Americans who visit the cemetery think World War II is ancient history, but to her and her fellow French in the region, it's still relevant. Now it's time for some audience participation. Pictured here in Normandy are citizens of one of the European countries listed. They are either from England, France, Switzerland, or Germany. They are dressed as World War II U.S. Army soldiers. Even the women are in uniform or period dress. Please choose which country you think it is. And the answer is Switzerland. But don't feel badly if you missed it. I had one person who saw this program twice and missed it both times. Can you believe the Swiss, known for their neutrality since the beginning of time, are dressed as U.S. soldiers? Omaha Beach, known as Bloody Omaha. There are estimates that up to 2,000 U.S. soldiers died at Omaha Beach on D-Day. This is the monument to the National Guard on Omaha Beach. The monument is located there because so many National Guard soldiers died there. It's built on top of a German bunker whose dreaded 88mm cannon annihilated many of the guardsmen on the beach. The inscription reads, "We too, born to freedom and believing in freedom, are willing to fight to maintain freedom. We and all others who believe as deeply as we do would rather die on our feet than live on our knees." President Franklin Roosevelt. The Normandy American Cemetery is located on a bluff high above Omaha Beach, where the American soldiers finally broke out on D-Day. The cemetery consists of 172 acres and contains the graves of 9,387 American soldiers killed in France in World War II. In the movie Saving Private Ryan, the opening and closing scenes were filmed at the cemetery. President Obama and other world leaders celebrated the 65th anniversary of D-Day at the cemetery in 2009. I'm at Omaha Beach at high tide with my tour guide, a young Frenchman who grew up in the area, who spoke perfect English, and whose grandfather was in the resistance. I asked him how often he visited the United States, and he replied, about 3 times a week. I was perplexed, but he explained that the Normandy American Cemetery is American soil, given to the United States by the French government, and that he takes tours there about 3 times a week. I wanted to find out more about this American soil in France, so I emailed the American Battle Monuments Commission, who explained that the cemetery was not technically U.S. soil because it wasn't owned by the United States. However, France had leased the land to the United States to use as a cemetery forever for free. But that technicality didn't matter to my tour guide. The cemetery was U.S. soil as far as he was concerned, and that was all that mattered to him. Visiting the cemetery is an emotional experience, as his photograph of Mrs. Reagan shows. However, for my wife, it was too emotional. Shortly after walking past the graves, She said she could feel a mother's pain, and it was just too much to bear. Hippo Vauclair of Normandy is on the left with his friend and hero, U.S. Army Normandy veteran Jack Port of Escondido, California. They are pictured at the rededication of the Pointe du Hoc Memorial on the 2011 D-Day anniversary. Jack is an Army veteran who landed in Normandy with the 4th Infantry Division. When he graduated Escondido High School, he was, in his words, just a punk, but the Army turned him into a soldier in 12 weeks. Although he was just a buck private when he landed in France, when he returns to Normandy for the D-Day anniversaries, he is treated like General Eisenhower. He did receive the Bronze Star for heroic achievement during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. His citation reads, Jack Port, 39710-814, Technical Sergeant, then Private First Class, Headquarters Company, 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry, for heroic achievement in connection with military operations against an enemy of the United States near Konsdorf, Luxembourg, 16 December to 24 December 1944. Sergeant Port, a message center clerk, volunteered to go forward to defend a gap in the regimental front created by heavy losses of personnel from enemy action. For 8 days, he heroically held his position with very little sleep or rest, despite extremely heavy enemy small arms, mortar, and artillery fire. During this period, he manned a machine gun and laid down highly effective fire on the enemy. Between midnight and dawn of 22 December, 2 enemy patrols attempted to bypass his position. By his alertness and accurate fire, he inflicted casualties upon and helped repulse the patrols. Sergeant Port's alert and determined actions reflect credit upon himself and the military service." End quote. Jack also received the French Legion of Honor Medal in Paris at a ceremony in 2009, attended by Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, and others. I was privileged to accompany Jack on his return to Normandy during D-Day week over the last 5 years, and much of this program is based on my travels with him. In the picture on the left, a young Frenchman proudly gives Jack World War II shell casings he has collected from the countryside near his home. This scene takes place outside the town hall of Saint-Poix, a small town in Normandy that was liberated by Jack's division more than a month after D-Day. Jack has just been made an honorary citizen of Saint-Poix after a champagne ceremony at Town Hall. Jack was also followed for much of the day by a TV film crew from Normandy's Channel 3. There were over 14,000 civilian deaths in Normandy during the summer following D-Day, many caused by Allied bombing. In this photograph, a woman with her daughter returns home to Saint-Mary-Église on June 8th after learning her husband was killed by Allied bombs on D-Day. In spite of all the civilian deaths caused by the Americans, the French still welcome the American veterans as liberators. At the Brittany American Cemetery, Jack is comforting Hippo, who has begun to weep while reading his poem entitled, "Welcome to Our Liberators." The following is the English translation of Hippo's poem. "Welcome to our liberators. No, we never forget them. Their sacrifice will not be in vain. They are always here among us, alive, present, indestructible. As for me, I will keep in the bottom of my heart the memory of their smiles and their laughing eyes. All my life I know that I will never, oh never forget them. I always see the kind and proud eyes of the brave American men who sang of life and hope. All of us for whom they died, we are not forgetting them. Welcome to our liberators. Memory Flowers, the English translation of Les Fleurs de la Mémoire, an association of French citizens. The following is an English translation of their charter. The association is created to perpetuate the memory of the over 13,000 American soldiers, sailors, and airmen buried in the American cemeteries at Omaha and Brittany by placing flowers on their tombs. Peace is precious, and it has a price. It is an effort. Always it is of blood, and too often its price is paid by men's lives. The peace we know in Normandy and France was paid for by the sacrifice of the young lives of Allied soldiers. Today we know the liberty and happiness of freedom. We can never forget those that are buried in our country. 2 generations have passed that do not know the horrors of war. Nothing is truly won. It is imperative that we do not hide the past to preserve the future. Therefore, in a gesture of respect, remembrance, and friendship, the families and members of the association commit in writing to lay a bouquet of flowers on the grave of a soldier. 1 time per year, if possible on the American Memorial Day, to remember the sacrifices of these brave men. The family that takes responsibility for placing flowers on the grave will pass this responsibility on to its children to ensure the perpetuation of the obligation. 3,700 members currently take care of over 10,000 American graves. Why do the French love Americans? Let's hear Hippo's story. Hippo Vauclair is 80 years old now, but was just 6 when the Germans occupied France in his hometown of Saint-Lô in Normandy. My remaining words in this program are a translation of the email Hippo sent me describing his liberation by Jack's Army Division 52 days after D-Day. On June 17, 1940, I saw my mother and father crying when the Germans were marching in front of our house. I was 6 years old, and for 4 years we were plunged into a life without liberty. But in 1943, I began to hear people say that the Americans were coming. I remember very well Tuesday, June 6, 1944. I was leaving for school and we heard the big guns on Omaha Beach 40 kilometers away. And my parents told me I was not going to school today. The Americans are coming. We waited with our fears for 52 days while the battles raged. Today, my memories are clear, so much so that I can still hear the bombs exploding near us and the gunfire from American planes strafing the convoys of German soldiers. I remember seeing the American soldiers taken prisoner by the Germans and seeing the dead animals littered along the road that gave off the odor of death. On Tuesday, August 1, 1944, around 8:30 in the morning, we heard the noise of a motor and then saw an American Jeep with 3 soldiers coming to liberate us. My mother and father cried, but this was a day of joy, the joy of our liberation. This was a moment of extreme happiness, a moment that I will never experience again in my life. This is why we love the Americans. We were in darkness and they gave us light. But what a price the American soldiers paid. I will never forget that the Battle of Normandy lasted 100 days. 29,000 American soldiers died. So you should be proud of being an American. Without the courage of all these American soldiers, where would we be today? That is why when I encounter an American, I salute him. And when I encounter a hero, like our friend Jack, I embrace him. Yes, I know the price of our liberty, and I will never forget America. I love you. This is Douglas Gordon, creator of Normandy Loves Us, The Untold Story, and president of the Patton Foundation. Please visit the Patton Foundation's website at thepattonfoundation.org for more information.